had been working at Richard Blake's mansion for almost 3 years. Since his separation from his wife, Richard had become more quiet and cold than ever. His mansion, a modern architectural work set amidst a large garden on the outskirts of the city, was where Evelyn spent most of her time, tending and maintaining perfection in every corner. Although the job required meticulousness and patience, Evelyn had always shown dedication and professionalism, but she never expected to be called to attend such an important event. One evening, as the sunset began to dye the sky red, Richard called Evelyn into his study. He was munching on his favorite biscuit, his eyes fixed on the computer screen with its complex numbers and charts. With no time to look for a suitable companion, he turned to see Evelyn cleaning the bookshelves in the room. "Evelyn, I need you to accompany me to an important business party tonight," Richard said in a cold and stiff voice. "This is not an invitation, but an order. You need to behave properly and keep the information confidential. I need someone who is discreet." Evelyn was a little surprised by this unexpected request, but she did not show her emotions. She understood that this could be an opportunity to prove her worth, not just as a maid. "Yes, sir," she replied calmly, her eyes not wavering. When she arrived at the luxurious restaurant in the heart of the city, Evelyn was carefully prepared with an elegant navy blue evening gown. Richard was waiting at the entrance of the restaurant, his expression annoyed and impatient. He did not look at Evelyn in a friendly way, just glanced at her with a cold gaze and ordered, "Let's go." As they entered the restaurant, the large space with its high ceiling, sparkling lights and soft music attracted everyone's attention. The group of investors were waiting at a central table, the men in elegant suits sizing each other up. Richard introduced Evelyn vaguely and indifferently. "This is Evelyn. She will be accompanying me tonight." Without mentioning their full names, he quickly looked away and turned away. The investors smiled politely, but some eyes were filled with surprise and confusion. Evelyn sensed the silent appreciation, but she remained calm and confident. Throughout the dinner, Richard and the investors discussed figures, profits, and business expansion plans. Evelyn listened quietly, observing every detail and seizing every opportunity to show off her. At some point, Mr. Lewis, a tall investor with an imposing presence, turned to Evelyn with a contemptuous smile. "So, Evelyn, how does it feel to be at a business dinner like this?" he asked, his tone clearly expecting a timid response. Sensing the tension at the table, Evelyn decided not to conform to that expectation. He replied calmly but confidently, "It's really interesting to see things up close. It's important to look at financial details and forecasts, but I believe it's equally important to understand the people behind the numbers." The table froze in that moment. Evelyn remained calm, while Richard looked at her with surprise and annoyance. This was the first time she had expressed her own opinion, something Richard had asked her to stay away from. Mr. Lewis, instead of being angry, seemed more interested in Evelyn's answer. "An interesting perspective," he chuckled. "It's rare to hear that around here." When the topic turned to corporate social responsibility, Evelyn did not hesitate to take the opportunity to contribute. "Mr. Lewis, have you considered social projects within the company?" she asked, her eyes full of determination as she turned to Richard. Richard hesitated, his face clearly uncomfortable with the question. Before he could give a vague answer, Evelyn answered herself. "I believe that social initiatives are a way to give back to the community for the success the company has achieved. After all, the company exists for more." Silence fell over the table, all eyes on Evelyn. But instead of backing down, she maintained her composure. For her, this was a matter of integrity. Mr. Lewis, clearly impressed by her courage, smiled. "Yes, Evelyn, that's what I think. It's rare to hear that here." As other investors began to express a new curiosity about Evelyn, Richard felt the situation becoming more and more difficult to control. He tried to hide his discomfort, but this only made things worse. Evelyn, however, was not swayed. She continued to stand her ground, even as the topic continued to turn to social projects, adding insightful and persuasive comments. The evening turned out to be completely different from what Richard had planned. Evelyn was not only a companion, but also a person who completely changed the dynamic of the party. The investors began to look at her with respect and admiration, while Richard felt himself losing control of the situation. When the party ended, Richard did not wait for Evelyn to leave, but hurriedly left, leaving her standing alone in the luxurious space filled with lights and sounds. Evelyn, although not needing his company, still maintained her confident and calm demeanor. She knew that she had stood up for her voice, and that was more important than any acceptance from Richard. Back at the mansion, Richard could not contain his anger. He called Evelyn into his office again, abandoning all formality. His eyes were full of disappointment and hatred. "What do you think, Evelyn?" he said sharply. "I told you to come with me to keep the information confidential, not to be the center." Evelyn remained calm after the tense evening. She knew this conversation wouldn't end well, but she didn't regret her actions. "You asked me a question, and I answered honestly," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I just wanted to contribute to the conversation, not disrupt it." When Richard exclaimed, "You're just a housekeeper, Evelyn. You're not paid to have an opinion at this business party," his eyes were filled with contempt. Evelyn sensed the injustice in Richard's words, but she remained calm. "If my presence was so disturbing, why did you invite me?" she replied, her voice calm but Richard, with his cold and calculating demeanor, refused to be persuaded. "This is your last day here. You're fired." His statement was a final judgment, but Evelyn showed no signs of being affected. She nodded, maintaining her dignity, stood up, and turned away from the mansion, knowing that she would no longer have to endure Richard's contempt. That night had opened up a clear vision of herself and her future. The next morning, as she was packing up the last of her belongings, the phone rang again. It was Mr. Lewis, the investor who had been impressed by her determination at the party. He wanted to invite Evelyn to join his team in a position she had never. With surprise and determination, Evelyn accepted the offer. The humility of being fired quickly turned into a golden opportunity in her career. Over the next months, under Mr. Lewis's guidance, Evelyn discovered talents and abilities that she had never had the opportunity to demonstrate while working for Richard. Her determination and leadership skills quickly attracted the attention of her colleagues, and Evelyn became a respected figure in the company. Evelyn had finally found an environment where her voice was heard and appreciated. Meanwhile, Richard's situation was getting worse. Impulsive decisions focused on short-term profits have caused his company to suffer, and Richard's arrogance has cost him important contracts and valuable business partners. The complete reversal occurred when the company Evelyn worked for acquired a significant portion of Richard's company, placing Evelyn in a leadership position directly related to his business. The encounter took place at an important meeting of the leaders, when Richard walked into the room and saw Evelyn sitting at the conference table. His face was pale, his eyes lingering on her, as if trying to understand how the former housekeeper could appear among the leaders. Evelyn returned his gaze firmly but calmly, showing no sign of resentment. What mattered was her new position and the opportunity to make a difference. After the meeting, Richard approached Evelyn with a stiff expression, a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "Evelyn," he muttered, trying to keep his composure, "so now you're here with them." Edward Selverin stood firm, not letting his surprise affect her demeanor. "Yes, I am here. And as you can see, our company has acquired a significant stake in your company." Richard smirked to hide his unease. "This is ridiculous. Do you think that just because you have a position here, you understand what true leadership is?" Evelyn kept her composure. In my time working for you, I have learned exactly what not to do to lead a team and how to ignore blind arrogance. As Richard moved closer, his face almost touched hers, but Evelyn did not back down. Don't think this changes anything between us. Evelyn crossed her arms and looked straight back. That is the difference between us, Richard. I don't need your respect. I earned my position, and it was not luck. You are sinking because you only value yourself. This confrontation exposed the flaws that Richard had tried to ignore all his life. Evelyn became the mirror he feared the most, showing his mistakes without any pity. Her words echoed in Richard's mind like a bitter truth that he wished he had never heard. From then on, Richard began to realize the mistakes that had pushed him to the brink of bankruptcy. Instead of burying himself in strategies to save himself, he took time to reflect on all his hasty decisions. A few days later, Richard and Evelyn were invited to an important meeting with investors. The atmosphere was tense. The future of the company seemed to depend on this meeting. Richard, nervous and tired, entered the room with a stiff posture, trying. Evelyn was there, calmly reviewing the documents. As soon as they sat down, the investors began to speak frankly about how Richard's company was in dire straits and that they needed urgent change. Richard tried to convince the judges with new plans, but it was clear that his vision was still superficial and focused only on short-term profits. When everyone began to doubt, Evelyn spoke up unexpectedly. The direction of the company needs to change. Profit targets are no longer enough. We need to reconnect the brand with people, make a strong commitment to social responsibility, and treat. Investors began to take notice and invited Evelyn to continue. She spoke confidently about the benefits of integrating social projects and humanizing the company, creating positive impact and ensuring a sustainable future. Next to her, Richard felt helpless. Not only did he notice the confidence in Evelyn's every word, he also saw the admiration from the investors for her. The truth was clear. He was losing control of everything, and Evelyn was saving her company. By the end of the meeting, the investors were more confident in Evelyn's proposals, while Richard felt lonely and humiliated. Evelyn had proven that perseverance and a broad vision can bring sustainable success, while Richard was left with only regret for what. As Evelyn presented her plans and they left the conference room, Richard suddenly stopped in the hallway. Evelyn noticed his pause and turned around to ask, "Why did you do that?" He asked in a voice filled with disbelief, "Why did you help me save this company?" Evelyn took a deep breath and answered without hesitation, "Because unlike you, I believe in the value of people. Richard, more than that, I believe in a better future for this company, with or without you." The words hit him hard, causing him to stand still, absorbing their meaning. For the first time, Richard felt something beyond pride and self-reliance. He felt a genuine desire to change and become a better person. Evelyn observed him for a long time and then turned away. Richard realized that the woman he had once ignored had become his most important role model. Richard could not forget Evelyn's words. He realized he had made many mistakes, but the feeling that Evelyn was judging him at every step made him want to make amends. However, he also felt that Evelyn had become a symbol of everything he had yet to achieve. The desire to change was present, but so was the desire to prove that he still had something to contribute. The tension between them became unbearable. Evelyn, with her impeccable manner and sharp words, seemed to see through his every intention before he could even speak, which deeply angered him. That week, an important meeting with the investment committee was scheduled. The financial situation was still fragile, and Richard knew that any wrong decision could ruin everything. He was determined to demonstrate his leadership and prove to Evelyn that on the day of the meeting, Evelyn arrived early and prepared the entire presentation. Richard, on the other hand, prepared a parallel speech, one he intended to introduce at the meeting to add a little more boldness to the. He believed that this move would be enough to impress the board and demonstrate his commitment. However, as the meeting began and Evelyn presented her plan to stabilize growth without sacrificing resources, Richard realized that the board members were leaning toward her. Still, he stuck to his guns. "I understand Evelyn's plan," Richard said, interrupting her at a crucial point in the presentation, "but I believe the expansion needs to be done more aggressively. We need to show the market that we are in a new phase." Evelyn looked at him with disbelief and criticism. She knew Richard was trying to prove something, but this was not the time to show off his ego. Controlling her tone, she replied, "Richard, are you aware that this approach has caused us serious problems in the past? We are focused on restructuring the company and prioritizing our mission over rapid growth." The board paid attention to their exchange, clearly divided. However, Richard could not back down and continued, "I understand your concerns, but if we don't take risks, we will be stuck in mediocrity, which will slowly destroy the company. The company needs a strong presence, needs to show results." Evelyn shook her head, still keeping her composure. "The company needs consistency, Richard. The people we're helping need a sustainable project. We've moved past acting like a company driven by the egos of our leaders." The tension in the room was palpable as some board members looked at Evelyn with sympathy, while others seemed willing to hear Richard's point of view. The board chairman, Mr. Haynes, intervened and asked the two to present a joint proposal at the next meeting. Evelyn nodded, maintaining her composure, but Richard felt like he had lost the battle. He realized he was no longer in control of the company he had built, and his sense of helplessness grew. That night, Richard stayed in his office reviewing financial reports, trying to figure out how to make his proposal more appealing. His mind was full of ideas, but none of them were truly viable without compromising the stability of the brand. At that moment, a message from an old acquaintance appeared on his phone. It was an entrepreneur who was willing to invest a significant amount of money in the company in exchange for some control over social project. He would gain a solution. He would get the necessary capital and at the same time prove to Evelyn that he was also capable of acting in the company's best interests. Without consulting Evelyn or the board, he arranged a meeting with the investor for the next. During the meeting, he presented his vision for rapid growth and within hours signed the initial contract. Richard felt victorious. He finally had something concrete to prove his leadership ability. However, when Evelyn learned about the deal, as soon as she heard about the deal, Evelyn went to Richard's office. He was on a video call with a new investor, talking excitedly about the expansion plan. But when he saw Evelyn walk in, a cold feeling ran down his spine. She was angry, and he knew he wouldn't get away. When the call ended, Evelyn crossed her arms and looked at him with a cold gaze that made him shiver. "You signed the contract without the consent of the board. How could you do that?" Richard took a deep breath, preparing for the upcoming argument. "Evelyn, this is the opportunity we need to expand. I'm trying to save the company, just like you. Save the company. Richard, do you realize this is too risky a move? This investor now has a say in our social project decisions. What happens when he starts to want to control everything for his own benefit? Evelyn, this is a calculated risk. He doesn't control, he just wants a small part, no more." She narrowed her eyes. "And what about commitment to human values, acting transparently? This is not the kind of leadership we promised to build." Those words hit him like a punch in the stomach. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but also angry at Evelyn's constant judgment. "Why do you always expect me to fail? I'm trying, Evelyn. I want to do the right thing." Evelyn sighed, her gaze softening a little but still firm. "It's not that I want you to fail, Richard. It's that you need to understand the implications of your actions. Leadership is not just about making big decisions. It's about taking responsibility. Acting in secret only shows that you don't understand that yet." Richard looked away, feeling the weight of her words. "Perhaps I will never understand as well as you want me to." Evelyn nodded. Perhaps, but until you do, you will continue to break the promises you made, and that's too heavy a responsibility to bear. 2 weeks later, the board met again to discuss the agreement that Richard had signed without approval. The members were concerned about the consequences of the contract, and the atmosphere in the room became tense. As the meeting began, Evelyn was the first to express her concerns. This contract represents a change in the principles we have established. We now have an outside investor involved in our social projects. I believe everyone here understands the risks. Mr. Haynes, the chairman of the board, after hearing Evelyn's objections, asked Richard to explain his decision. Richard swallowed his tears and remained calm. I believe that this investment will provide the financial strength needed to expand and make the project sustainable in the long term. This is not just a financial issue. We are working with a social purpose that cannot be compromised. You acted impulsively. Richard felt the pressure increase as he looked at Evelyn, who had always been his driving force and his biggest challenge in his journey to save the company. In the dim light of the conference room, Evelyn's eyes were filled with complete disbelief. Richard realized that he had lost more than the board's trust. He had lost his last chance to prove his ability to change. When the meeting ended, the board decided to reconsider Richard's position, possibly reducing his power in future decisions. Richard quietly left the conference room, feeling completely defeated. It was in that moment that he realized that if he truly wanted to change, he would need to let go of his ego. Evelyn was not only trying to correct his actions, but was also teaching him a new way of leading. For the first time, Richard began to understand that the leadership style he had always known was no longer appropriate here. After the disastrous meeting with the board, Richard was on the brink of an emotional meltdown. His sense of failure followed him home, a place that had once symbolized his success, but now felt empty and he had spent years building a solid career and a strong reputation. But suddenly everything he had achieved seemed to be falling apart. He knew it wasn't just the board or Evelyn that was to blame, but his own choices. Everything he had worked to build with Evelyn had fallen apart because of his impulsive decisions and stubbornness. Richard couldn't escape the fact that he was still acting with the same selfishness and short-termism that had always driven him, pushing him away from his team, the board, and most importantly, Evelyn. The next morning, Richard decided to go to the office early. The feeling of emptiness and regret seemed overwhelming, but he needed to understand what had driven him to act the way he did. He knew there was no point in confronting Evelyn or the board. He needed answers for himself, sitting in his office, surrounded by reports and notes. Richard began to analyze his decisions in a way he had never done before. He still treated the company like a profit machine. Now he began to understand the weight of those words and wondered what leadership really meant if he had ever understood its essence. That morning, looking at the empty office, Richard realized that true leadership had probably never been a part of his life. Maybe he had just been playing the role of a cold, calculating businessman who believed that success depended solely on numbers. But now, faced with the loss of his position and the trust of everyone around him, he began to understand that his leadership needed to go beyond the numbers. Richard knew he needed to look at the people who had become more than resources on a spreadsheet. Late in the afternoon, Evelyn appeared at the office door with a serious expression, but this time without the coldness of before. Perhaps she was seeing his vulnerability for the first time. Tired of the arguments and conflicts, Richard decided to be Evelyn. I know I've made mistakes. I know my decisions have affected more people than I can fix, and I understand if you think it's no longer worth trying. Evelyn watched him silently, her arms folded tightly, but her posture seemed open to listening. It's a start, she said in a softer voice, but just recognizing the mistake isn't enough. What do you plan to do about it? Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. I don't know, Evelyn. I just know I can't go on like that. Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes, real change is something that needs to be practiced every day. You need to learn to listen and understand that leadership is not always about control, but about service. Are you still willing to do it? Richard swallowed hard. Yes, I am willing, but I don't know if I can do it alone. Evelyn smiled slightly, as if she saw a glimmer of hope. No one can do it alone. That's why real leadership must be done in cooperation. You need to trust others. You need to know that you can't do everything alone. Her words echoed in his mind exactly what he had always done, trying to control everything alone, believing that trusting others would weaken his power. But now, facing his own limitations, he began to see that perhaps trust was what he lacked in his leadership. After a long silence, Evelyn continued, "If you really want to change, there is a way, but it will be difficult and will require you to abandon everything you believe about leadership." Richard raised his head, finally feeling a sense of genuine hope. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Show me how I can help." That week, Evelyn took Richard to his first social project as part of the company's recovery commitment. The project focused on empowering vulnerable women to enter the work. For Richard, accustomed to the pomp and formality of the corporate environment, this communal space felt truly uncomfortable. During one of the meetings with the women, Richard found himself sitting among people he never imagined he would meet. Single mothers, women surviving abusive relationships, and others struggling to provide for their families. As he listened to their stories, Richard began to feel the impact of each one. It wasn't about numbers or profits. It was about people, about lives that depended on every dollar, every opportunity. At the end of the meeting, a woman approached him, an old woman with silver hair and deep eyes. "Are you Richard Blake, the owner of the company that is currently supporting this project?" she asked in a strong voice. Richard nodded awkwardly. "Yes, I am." The woman looked at him for a long moment. "My son worked for you a few years ago. He was fired without explanation. After many years of dedication to your company, it took all his motivation away." Richard felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." She shook her head slowly. "Maybe you never cared, but today I saw you here and I thought maybe things are changing. I just hope that this change is real." Richard felt small and exposed, the woman's words ringing like an undeniable truth. For years, he had inadvertently caused so much pain without realizing it. He was the businessman Evelyn had described, someone who didn't understand the value of back in the office, still affected by today's experience. Richard looked up at Evelyn and thanked her for leading him to the project. "I really understand what you mean today," he said. Evelyn smiled softly. "Glad to hear that, Richard." He spoke honestly. Evelyn looked at him, and this time there was no coldness in her eyes, only understanding. "This is just the beginning, Richard. Change takes time and action. Perhaps in time you will understand that leadership is service." That week, Evelyn encouraged him to attend a meeting with the social project team. This would be an important moment for him to hear the concerns and suggestions of his staff, which he had always dismissed. As he entered the meeting room, Richard felt the eyes of the team on him. Some were skeptical while others were expectant. He knew he had a lot to prove, and that time was short to earn their trust. Evelyn encouraged him to speak up, but he hesitated, realizing that it might be best to listen before speaking. The meeting began with testimonials from each member, sharing their views and concerns about the project's progress. One of them, Mark, an idealistic and dedicated young man, spoke about the challenges the project was facing due to lack of resources and the pressure to produce quick results. "We need consistency," Richard told Mark in a firm but respectful tone. "Social projects cannot be viewed as short-term investments. These people depend on us, and that requires commitment and patience." Richard listened carefully to every word, understanding the impact of previous decisions. He realized that Mark, like Evelyn, wanted the project to grow, but with a clear and sustainable purpose. For the first time, He felt the desire to understand other people's perspectives instead of imposing. After the meeting, Richard decided to get involved directly in the project, not as a leader but as a learner. He wanted to see firsthand how decisions made in the office affected people at the most basic level. Evelyn joined him on several visits to the communities served by the project. During one of his visits, Richard met Julia, a young mother who had found an opportunity to improve her life through the training program. She spoke movingly about how the project had helped her get a job and support her young daughter. Richard felt choked up as he listened to her story, a reminder that he was dealing with real lives, stories, struggles, and dreams. This was not just a spreadsheet project, but the real impact of the work Evelyn had so boldly championed. He understood that the most important results were not the numbers, but the personal transformations of the people the project touched. Back in the office, Richard found Evelyn with a more serious and determined tone. "You were right, Evelyn. I always saw this as an extension, something to improve my image and get me back on top. But today I realized that my vision was completely." Evelyn looked at him, weighing her words. "So what are you going to do now?" He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I want to learn to do it right, to serve, to see the real impact of what we build. I want the people involved in these projects to find something I never had. Real leadership." Evelyn nodded, seeing the sincerity in Richard for the first time, and began to see in every decision, every conversation, that he could make change not just with words but with actions. Over the next few weeks, Richard continued to participate in projects, closely monitoring the progress of each initiative and learning from the team. His role gradually changed from being the leader who gave orders to being the one who listened. Gradually, the change in Richard's behavior began to be noticed by the board. He became more open to feedback and less hasty in his decisions. Evelyn also observed his progress, though she remained cautious, knowing that true change is a slow and board members could not hide their satisfaction. Mr. Haynes, the board chairman, commented in one of the meetings, "Richard, I see you are taking this project with a seriousness that many of us did not expect. This pilot project has been a success, and I am sure we can expand it sustainably." Richard smiled slightly, feeling the weight of this approval. He knew that Evelyn had been an indispensable guide in this process, and he had always acknowledged her work at every meeting. However, what had been just professional admiration was slowly turning. As they spent more time together, Richard began to see Evelyn in a different light. Not only was she an excellent leader, but she was also a strong, honest woman who was passionate about her work. He noticed this in the way she interacted with each member of the project, her attention to detail, and the respect she showed everyone. Evelyn was a quiet, inspiring force, trusted by everyone. During a community visit, Richard and Evelyn attended an event hosted by the project's beneficiaries. The participants had prepared a simple ceremony to thank the team. Upon arriving, Richard watched Evelyn interact with everyone with a natural kindness that touched him deeply. She seemed to belong there, and everyone responded to her warmth and presence. "She really knows these people," Richard thought to himself, admiring. Evelyn was not only leading the project, but also a part of it, and everyone felt it. When the ceremony ended, Richard offered to walk Evelyn back to his office. As they walked through the quiet streets of the community, he felt the urge to get to know her better. Evelyn was an enigmatic figure, and he wanted to know more about what drove her to be so passionate about their work. "Evelyn," he began softly, "I've always admired your dedication to this project. What made you so deeply involved?" She smiled sincerely, her eyes shining. "I think I've always felt the need to do something beyond myself. When I was young, I watched loved ones face hardship, and it left a deep mark. Working on a project that could help others start over was the best way for me to give meaning to my own life." The words struck a chord with Richard. He had never allowed himself to look at work that way. For him, it was a way to build a reputation and a legacy. But for Evelyn, it was a personal mission. From that moment on, he began to understand more about what motivated the extraordinary woman beside him. Over the following weeks, Richard and Evelyn began to work more closely. What had been a formal and cautious partnership now became comfortable and filled with mutual admiration. They discussed strategies, shared ideas, and supported each other in every. However, Richard realized that something had changed in his heart. He not only admired Evelyn, but he had also begun to love her. This feeling surprised him. Richard, who had always been cautious and even skeptical about personal relationships at work, now found himself thinking about Evelyn often, looking for ways to be with her and see her smile. She was a firm but welcoming presence who inspired him to be better and pushed him forward. One night after a long meeting, they stayed in the office to discuss the future of the project. The conversation started out professionally but quickly became more personal. Richard took the opportunity to express his gratitude. "Evelyn, I really owe you a lot for what I've learned over the past few months. I used to think success was about control and expansion, but you've taught me that true value lies in building." Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the depth of his words. "I'm so glad this means something to you. Richard, seeing the change in you is one of the most rewarding things I've ever experienced." Their eyes met, and for a moment a gentle, comfortable tension filled the air. Richard felt like he wanted to get closer, but he hesitated. He didn't want to cross a line that might jeopardize their professional relationship. However, he knew that what he felt for Evelyn was real. As the days passed, Richard became more and more drawn to Evelyn. He noticed the little details about her, the way she smiled when she talked about something she was passionate about, the way she inspired those around her, and her tenacity in defending the goals. He realized that Evelyn was unique, bringing a depth and meaning to his life that he had never experienced. One particularly long night at the office, as they reviewed reports together, Richard, without thinking, let slip a comment. "You know, you're one of the most wonderful people I've ever met." Evelyn chuckled, surprised by the sincerity of her words. "Thank you, Richard. But I think you've changed a lot and become an admirable person." Her words resonated in his heart, and he realized that he was truly in love. But this time, it wasn't just a passing fancy or attraction, but a deep admiration, a desire to share Evelyn's mission and build something meaningful together. That night, as he walked home, Richard understood that the change Evelyn had brought him was more than just a professional one. She had changed his heart, and he knew that no matter what the future held, his life would never be the same. Time continued to pass, and Richard and Evelyn grew closer. Their professional relationship gradually morphed into a more intimate one, deepening with each interaction. Richard, once driven by ego and power, now found himself sharing vulnerable and authentic moments with Evelyn. He felt lighter, more alive, and above all, more whole. Evelyn felt the same. As she spent more time with Richard, she saw how he had changed into a truly admirable man. His transformation was more than just physical, it was genuine, and it attracted her in ways she had never expected. Over the next few weeks, Richard found small ways to get closer to Evelyn. He invited her to lunch after meetings, suggested taking walks together at the end of a long day, and always found time to talk about things outside of work. They shared stories about their lives, their fears, and their dreams. Gradually, the lines between professional and personal become blurred, and they find themselves in a new space where emotions are clear but unspoken. One night after a stressful day at work, Richard and Evelyn stay in the office to review a final report. The dim lights and the silence of the night create an intimate and comfortable space. They sit next to each other, their arms almost touching, and Richard can't help but feel a wave of longing and tenderness as he looks at her. Richard looked at Evelyn with gratitude in his eyes. "You know, I want to thank you," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "for everything, for teaching me, for believing in me when I didn't deserve it." Evelyn was surprised by the depth of his voice. "You don't need to thank me, Richard. The change came from you. I was just your guide," she replied softly, smiling warmly. But Richard had more to say. The thoughts that had been weighing on his chest for days were making his heart beat faster. He knew it was time to be honest about his feelings. "Evelyn," he began, hesitant but determined, "I can't hide my feelings anymore. The truth is, I love you." The words seemed frozen in the air. Evelyn fell silent, her eyes fixed on Richard. Richard felt his heart beat faster, afraid that he had made a mistake in expressing his feelings. Instead of retreating, however, Evelyn smiled softly, her eyes. "I love you too, Richard," she admitted with a sincerity that made his heart flutter. "I felt the same way for a while now, but I was afraid it would affect everything we built together." Richard chuckled softly, his laugh full of relief and emotion. "I was afraid of that too," he admitted, "but I can't pretend that these feelings don't exist anymore. I want to be with you for real, not just as colleagues, but as something deep." Evelyn nodded, still smiling. "I want that too. I think we're finally ready for something more." Still sitting next to each other, they moved closer, and Richard felt his heart leap as Evelyn's lips met his in a gentle but passionate kiss. It was a moment of complete connection, where all barriers melted away and only emotion remained. The kiss was followed by a hug, a loving gesture that sealed the decision to start a relationship. After that day, Evelyn and Richard's relationship blossomed. They began to date outside of work, explore the city, share cozy dinners and weekend getaways. Every moment together was an opportunity for them to get to know each other more deeply. The more they got to know each other, the more they realized how perfectly they complemented each other. At work, their relationship remained professional and focused, but their team noticed the sparkle in their eyes and the growing bond between them. Evelyn and Richard made it clear that even in their personal relationship, their commitment to the project always came first. However, it was clear that the love they shared also enhanced their dedication to their work. As time went on, their projects achieved new successes. The local community thrived, participants found employment opportunities and personal growth that had previously seemed impossible. The project's gradual expansion into other regions was underway, and the company received recognition for its positive and sustainable impact. The board was pleased and eventually gave Richard full approval to continue in his leadership role. Jennings, who was a harsh critic, congratulated him in a meeting. "Richard, you have shown us that change and learning are possible. The project is a success, and it is largely due to your commitment and vision. I am proud to say that you are a true leader." Richard humbly thanked him, knowing that the journey to get there had been long and challenging. He looked at Evelyn sitting next to him and felt a wave of gratitude for all that she had done for him. Without her, he knew he would not have come this far. Richard and Evelyn's relationship continued to thrive. They were happy together, and their love was deep and true. Richard felt he wanted to build a future with her, and he knew Evelyn felt the same. One sunny afternoon, as they were walking in the park, Richard took Evelyn's hand and stopped, looking straight into her eyes. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You've changed my life. Evelyn, I want to spend my life making you happy." Evelyn smiled, her eyes brimming with joy. "I want that too, Richard. You're not the man I used to know. You've become so much better, and I love you for who you've become." Richard smiled and kissed her right there in the park, under the rustling of leaves and the laughter of children. It was the beginning of a new journey for both of them, one that promised to be challenging but also rewarding. This time, they knew they would face it all together. The project continued to grow, and the company became a shining example of social responsibility and ethical leadership. Richard and Evelyn took on co-leadership roles, working together to ensure the positive impact continued to spread to new communities. Not only did they known as successful leaders, but also as an inspirational couple, proving that love, ethics, and dedication can change lives and build something truly meaningful. The company has received numerous awards and media acclaim for its social impact. But for Richard and Evelyn, the real legacy lies in the lives they have helped change. Financial success is important, but it pales in comparison to the joy of seeing families grow. People start over and dreams come true because of the work they began together. A few months later, in a small, intimate ceremony, Richard and Evelyn were married. Surrounded by friends, colleagues, and members of the community they helped transform. They exchanged vows of love and commitment. These were not just promises of romantic love, but also commitments to continue working together for a better world, to lead with their hearts, and to build a legacy that would last far beyond their lifetime. That night, as they danced under the stars, Richard realized how much his life had changed. The man who had once sought success at all costs now understood that true value lay in building something with purpose and passion alongside the woman he loved. And so Richard and Evelyn began a new chapter not only of their lives, but of a legacy that would continue to inspire and transform for years to come.